Ladies and gentlemen, taking our focus away from that elite world of the Renaissance and instead focusing on a movement that really would have touched every single life in Europe between 1517 and really through the 1600s up to about 1648. At least, you could say every life would have been touched by the Protestant Reformation. We're on the bottom of page 4. Find your way there. We're going to talk about the Renaissance popes and then move on through other problems of the church as well. What's meant by the Renaissance papacy? By Renaissance papacy, we mean individuals who are living the Renaissance life. Instead of being vicars of Christ or successors of Christ and modeling good, Christian, simple, pious lives, they're not. They're living lives in adoration of art, like Leo X, or lives where war is your great passion, Julius II, or Alexander VI, very fleshy pursuits, let's put it that way, if you remember the stories from class. The man was not focused on what he should have been focused on. Okay. Other problems within the church tended to focus really on the higher clergy, and there we're talking about simony, the buying of church offices, or pluralism, holding more than one church office, or the natural byproduct of both of those, absenteeism, where people aren't showing up to do the guiding work that you're supposed to be doing if you're a higher member of the clergy. All of those, as I said, are kind of your bishops, archbishops, cardinals. There's also problems at the roots of the church, though. Your parish priests who perhaps aren't as educated as they should be or moral as they should be. And so a lot of people on the ground felt as though the church hasn't done a good job of showing them how to live a good Christian life. And as a result of that, when Martin Luther starts rumbling things, there's going to be a lot of people who run to his side and help him. The Christian humanist at the top of page 5. A Christian humanist is someone who wants to take this new Renaissance learning and combine it with old scriptural love of Christ. Guys like Erasmus and Thomas More can see the problems in the church. They can see it. They are pointing them out using satire because that's the safest way to point these things out without getting barbecued. Unfortunately, the church doesn't seem to take criticism very well. But both Erasmus and More would tell you that if we go back to a simple, educated, pious, straightforward Christianity, a lot of these problems will fix themselves. The problem is getting the higher-ups to believe that that's the right thing to do. Both of those men, Erasmus and Thomas More, were fans of Martin Luther early on, and then when Luther broke with the church, they were not. Let's talk about Luther. Why does he write the initial 95 Thesis? Luther writes the 95 Thesis to call for some sort of a questioning on the policy of indulgences. He believes that the church's use of indulgences borders now on abusive. An indulgence is an age-old church device used to compensate people who had done service for the church. So, for instance, if you fought in the Crusades, the church doesn't have a treasury to pay you. They give you indulgences, which could shorten your time in purgatory. So, in a sense, they were paying you in spiritual rewards. Now, the sale of those indulgences in the early 16th century to try and fundraise for the building of a new basilica in Rome, that didn't sit too well with Luther. And Luther called for some discussion of it. Now, the church's initial response is really to brush Luther off and make him seem as though he's an insignificant individual. And even when he finally comes to Worms to see Charles V in 1520, it doesn't go well. And Luther refuses to recant and, in fact, marches even farther away from the points that he had made. He begins to question the number of sacraments. He begins to question the Pope's role and whether or not we need a Pope. And he's putting forward a radically different religion. We'll talk about that in a moment. How did Luther react to the peasant revolts? Well, in 1525 and 26, hundreds of thousands of peasants in rural Germany rose up against their nobles, believing that Luther's message, which said basically we are all equals in the eyes of Christ, we are all brothers and sisters in Christianity, that message was meant as a political statement. And taking it as such, they rose up against their political leaders, their nobles. Now, Luther is in a real pickle here. A part of you has to understand that Luther believes that's a theological sentiment, not a political one. That the order of things on earth and the order of things in heaven are different. You may well be equal in heaven, but you are not necessarily equal on earth. Translation, you toe the line. You listen to the nobles. Now, other people would say that Luther's primary motivation here is political. That if he gets on the wrong side of the nobility in the early phase of his growth of his new church here in the first decade of its life, this never stands a chance of succeeding, and so therefore he backs the nobles and says that the nobles are in the right here, perhaps as a way of assuring that he has their support for his young, growing movement. The study guide instructs us to go to the back of the packet and to talk about the differences between Lutheranism and Catholicism. A simpler faith, Luther would tell you, less sacraments, 2 instead of 7, the 2 that are biblical, the 2 that basically Jesus takes part in, the communion and the baptism. Those 2 are redeemable. Do you have to have a celibate clergy? Luther would say no. The natural way for men and women to go about business in life is to have children. Luther himself, a former member of the church, married a former nun, Katharina von Bora, and they had 4 children. And Luther would say that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have kids. Life kind of goes on from that point afterwards. Now, Luther would also say that human beings should be able to read the Bible individually and interpret that Bible. And this contributes to a notion called the priesthood of all believers, that everyone has a right to read their own Bible and to hear it. The Catholic Church would say that you need kind of an intermediary at this point. You need someone to be able to bring the grace of God. The other important factor is how we're saved. Catholic teaching had said that you're really saved by 2 things, by the grace of God and by your good works, and that those 2 things added together could make for a good salvation. Now, Luther's going to say that good works, that's nothing. If God has all the grace in the world, then what is a human being to contribute to that or to take away from it? That doesn't seem to be a relevant thing. And so Luther's going to say that it's really God's grace that saves you. Marching back to the packet again here on page 5, what's an Anabaptist? The Anabaptists are an early movement of this Reformation who are kind of hated by everybody. They believed in adult baptism. They tended to be pacifist. They refused to pay taxes. And here's the dangerous one. They believed in the separation of church and state. Even Luther, even Henry VIII, Charles V for that matter, would all agree on the fact that the church and the state need to cooperate together as an organizing principle of each other. We can debate about which is more important, the church or the state, but they need to be together. And so the Anabaptists were scorned by people, hated. Okay. Define predestination. Predestination is a Calvinist belief that an individual is saved or damned from the moment that they are born. That the free will, in fact, that decides your life isn't so much free will. That God makes that decision, right? Think about Catholicism as saying that if you do the right things, if you do good works, that might make a difference. And then Luther says, no, it's really about grace, and it's about whether or not God wants to save you. And Calvin's saying, well, it's decided. You know, you either are in or you're not in, and that's all there is to it. And Calvin really spun these ideas at his Theocracy in Geneva. A theocracy is a government based on God's rules, and the rules then become kind of not just God's rules, but man's rules. Geneva was a pretty straight-laced town. No gambling, no swearing, no bright colors. The church pews were very hard to sit in. There's none of this ornament or anything in the religious services. Calvin wants a very austere society. He wants people who are sober and serious and absolutely hardworking, and then that will be the proof that God has chosen you and not somebody else. Moving on to page number 6 here, what are the goals and problems of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V? Well, Charles V is into a real tight spot here. He's inherited a realm that's incredibly wealthy, right? The New World is part of this as well. But he also has rival Italian states that are fighting each other. He has the Ottoman Empire pushing against the gates of Vienna in the east, and he has the Protestant Reformation rearing. So during his reign as emperor, until he steps down from that role in 1556, Charles is going to try and fight all of those things. When he leaves the job in 1556, he splits the job in 2 between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip II, as a way of saying no man can kind of do all of these things at the same time. Okay. Why did King Francis I, a Catholic from France, oppose a fellow Catholic, Charles V? Well, the French are always looking at their flank, and that eastern flank is dicey if it's organized. If there's one solid organizing principle there, that would make for strength on the French flank, and the French don't want that. And so if you're the French king, it makes sense for you to foment Protestant Reformation problems in the states to your east, states that are traditionally Catholic, because if they're fighting each other, then they're not fighting you. That's a pretty slick way to go about it. Let's talk about Henry VIII for a moment. Now, Henry VIII's Reformation is radically different from Luther's, right? Henry VIII is really about whether or not he can have a male heir, and he wants to get an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and he can't get one for reasons we've talked about in class. And when he can't get one, he finally decides, okay, I'm going to start my own new church. And he puts through a thing called the Act of Supremacy, which makes him the head of this church, which allows him then to have the annulment that he wants. His friend Thomas More, unfortunately, refuses to follow that Act of Supremacy and pays for it with his life. The Anglican Church is very Catholic. In fact, in class I kind of joke and I say it's kind of like Catholic light. It really has a lot of the same principles, the same number of sacraments, the same ideals about the clergy. There are no monasteries. Henry wants to make sure that the nobles are on his side, and so he chops up the monastery lands and gives those away to his nobles, which is a pretty wise political move, all things being the same. But overall, Henry's going to create a church that's very Roman as far as his practices go, which makes sense, right? He really isn't leaving on theological points. He's leaving because he can't get the annulment he wants, and so he needs to leave and do that. Briefly describe the religious ideas pursued by two of Henry's three children, Edward VI. Edward's a sickly young kid. He's king from his really young childhood, when he's 6 or 7, up to about 14 when he passes away. During his time, the Anglican faith is made more Anglican. That is to say, a little bit further away from the Catholic faith, but not much is going to happen that really the kid does. There's a lot of advisors that had served his father that are important during Edward VI's reign. And then Henry's daughter Mary gets to the throne, Bloody Mary. And Mary believes, we're going to take this back to Catholicism. And so she reverses the train, started by Henry and then continued by her stepbrother Edward, of being a Protestant nation, and creates a Catholic nation and persecutes the Protestants. And though she only reigns for a brief 5 years, manages to kill thousands of them before her stepsister Elizabeth comes in and decides that that sort of religious warfare is just going to make for trouble and turmoil, and takes the country back to a kind of tolerant Protestantism that we'll talk about later. So the religious reformations of the 16th and 17th century, as I said, touch every single life within Europe. We'll talk about more of that later. All right.